Philip Dearden, University of Victoria, Canada. I think connectivity is important and how well that group is connected to other potential allies.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Networking.
And do you also get a sense, I get a sense that there's the legitimate power and there's illegitimate power. So that there's, very often in a landscape, there's actors who are incredibly powerful, but really don't have, really are wielding that power in an illegitimate way. And so power to me is really important, and its relationship to legitimacy is really important, because you could have a very powerful actor who is trumping legitimate government's authorities in a potentially corrupt or inappropriate way.
And maybe the process of defining that and identifying that will give your conservation team some clues about how they might be able to strengthen the power of other groups within that landscape to begin to sort of stand up to this group with the illegitimate power. So it makes sense so far? We're good? Fiesta, I'm going to introduce Fiesta, who's going to come up and talk about sort of more details about the process and how we move through it.
My name is Fiesta Warewa. I work for the African Wildlife Foundation. My name is Fiesta. I work for the African Wildlife Foundation, and my part is really to take you through the different steps. And there are basically 5 steps that you have to follow if you were to implement the tool. And to first start with, we have 2 elements or 2 components of the steps. And the first component is the governance knowledge group. Here what you do is you kind of identify the different groups that exist within the landscape. Now once you identify them, you bring them together, and then they kind of help you map out the different actors that are involved within the landscape. Now, you give a bit of time for the participants to be able to kind of identify the principal types of natural resources existing within the landscape. Now, once you do that, then it gives them the chance. Normally, the number is between 5 to 6, so that it becomes a very participatory exercise. And then they kind of identify, after they identify, the next step is to find out what exactly each of these governance group would be actually monitoring or would be doing in terms of their authority over the resources. Now, the next one will be to select the most influential groups. And then this will then be followed by the local definition of good governance, and then assessing the governance strength and weaknesses of the governing groups. Now, the second component is about information and analysis. And that one comprises of 3 elements. That is the narrative of the strengths and weaknesses of the governing groups, and then ranking the groups under the 3 attributes, that's legitimacy, capacity, and power, and then being able to identify the leverage points for improving the governance of the landscape. Now, under step 1, you have governance inventory. As I initially said, what you do is you identify the different groups, and then talk to the participants, let them tell who is actually responsible for what and where. Now, the next step will be, once you identify, of course, you will come with a whole list of different groups that are existing within the landscape. But then you ask the participants perhaps to choose the 3 most top influential groups within the landscape. And then there you will probably end up with like the National Parks Service, or you could have the Ministry of Water, which could be identified as one of those ones that are influential in terms of water resources. The local chief within the landscape could also be very influential, especially when it comes to things like grazing lands. Then the second step will be now to ask them to what extent does each of these different governing groups influence the resources that they have. So what you then do is ask them now to vote. And then you give them a vote of like 3, and then once they vote for the 3, then that now takes you now to the next step of now trying to identify what do they actually think, or what is their local perception about the different groups. Now, the next question you would ask them is, what do they think is working well and what is not working well. What is it that is making them, or what is hindering them from not actually doing their governance work? Now, in that case, we have a very good example where when we tested the tool out in the field, we had a group of community leaders, and there were like about 10 of them. And we asked them, in terms of the most influential governing group that you have within the landscape, can you identify one of them? And they identified Kenya Wildlife Service as being one of the most influential groups that they have within the landscape. And we then asked them, what do you people think that is really working very well with Kenya Wildlife Service and what is not working very well? And then that took us then now to the next step. And what they did was, first of all, to identify the really strength of Kenya Wildlife Service, and they said they're very good in anti-poaching activities, for instance, both inside and outside the national parks. And then when it comes to legitimacy, they're actually the most legitimate body in terms of wildlife within Kenya. And this is because the law allows them to be in charge of wildlife, or they have the mandate to be in charge of wildlife both inside the protected areas and outside. But then one of the weaknesses, or a number of weaknesses they did identify about Kenya Wildlife Service. One is that their relationship with the communities living outside the protected areas was not really very good. And as one of the participants said, there is this feeling that it's more of a military sort of institution. They don't have very strong communication and relationship with the communities outside the parks. So it gives them that element of fear, and that they had identified as one of the biggest weaknesses that Kenya Wildlife Service has. Now, the second thing, or the second point that they also identified that was another weakness, was the fact that there's so much, the Kenya Wildlife Service is more confined to national parks. They are not doing much to actually secure space outside the protected areas. Most of these protected areas, or most of the areas that are outside the protected areas are communal areas. And because they don't have that strong relationship, it is now becoming very hard for the communities to be able to call upon them to help them secure those areas. So that assignment is basically left to the communities on their own. It's left to the conservation organizations that are working outside. And they feel that is one of the weaknesses that Kenya Wildlife Service has. So then, because you have a whole list of different kind of factors, then the next step, which is the fifth one, is you would want to have like a standard method within the landscape. And then you start asking them, can you be able to cluster now the strengths and weaknesses? Now, as you cluster the strengths and weaknesses, you cluster them based on the three attributes. That is legitimacy, capacity, and power. Now, they feel that, yes, Kenya Wildlife Service has the legitimacy over wildlife, they have the capacity, and they also have the power to arrest, because their mandate is to take care of wildlife outside protected areas. And especially in community conservation areas where the communities have recruited scouts, and the scouts do not have the power to be able to arrest poachers, then it becomes an added advantage for them to come in, for Kenya Wildlife Service rangers to come in and be able to arrest. And that's where the element of power then comes in. So you then ask them now to be able to cluster, and then once they cluster them into the three attributes. So we have an example there where you have the communities having a leadership council, you have the legal tenure that we're talking about, and then perhaps not enough revenue, and then you cluster each or three of them that have been identified under the three attributes. Then the final step is now to do the analysis. And now when you do the analysis, what you then do is in fact, the fourth point about this, the third point about the local perception is the point at which you have to really capture very good notes, because then it is the notes that will later then be able to help you get to the step 5, of where then you have to put a very detailed narrative of the weaknesses and the influence, and then also ask the participants to be able to rank and say from a score of -2 to a score of 2. -2 indicates the weaknesses, and then +2 indicates the strength. Now, the analysis will be able to help you to kind of identify the existing opportunities. As we earlier said, one of the purposes of conducting the exercise is to be able to identify where your targeted investment will have to go, and then also be able to assess over time whether that investment is really meeting the impact that is required on governance. So then you then do that, and after doing the analysis, you then do the tracking over time. Now, for instance, in our case, what we did was we then decided, after we had tested by pulling in all the different community leaders, we then decided and said, where can we actually test the tool again? And at what point do you want to test the tool, and when do you use the tool? Now, in this case, there could be a number of other different situations where you would want to use the tool. But we ended up with these 3 ones where we say you will start using the tool when you are getting into a new area, because you have perhaps no idea what's existing in the area, the kind of different players that are there, and it will help you get an understanding of what the governance issues are all about. Now, the second one is working with testing it or using it in an existing group. Now, we did the test with different community leaders in the landscape, and that's in southern Kenya. And then again, what we did was to take again the tool and test it now with very specific community conservation areas, where we pulled 2 community conservation areas that are supported by AWF, and then we brought the leaders together. And when we brought the leaders together, we then asked them, now, how do you people think, is your conservancy really improving? And the answer was, they feel the conservancy is improving, but then the leaders were very categorical. They said, you know we are legitimate. We decided to set for ourselves a constitution that should be able to guide us. But then the time frame that has been set up within the constitution is so short. You're talking of only 1 year. And the leaders felt within 1 year, the time is so short that they cannot actually be able to do something meaningful or be able to deliver results that can enable them be re-elected back to office again. Because then what the members of the Conservancy would do is try to measure them against the promises that they made. So that is one of the best examples. And as Paul said, or I think it was David, that you don't have to have a tool that is very, very expensive or that will cost you so much. You just make it as simple as possible, and then you're able to take it back to the communities to be able to test it over time. And the last point is you use it to be able to get an understanding of the new actors that can actually influence the governance system within the landscape. So basically, those are the 3 points that we came up with, and we thought that would help us be able to get an understanding of when exactly to use the tools. But there are so many other examples that are out there, and then perhaps what I could do is ask if there are any questions for some clarifications or some additions. Then any of my colleagues can be able to chip in.
Hello. Yeah, I'm Ben Ridley with Credit Suisse. I just wanted to ask a question with the context. These 8 areas in the study, are these all statutory or designated conservation areas existing, or what's the kind of arrangement of the land?
I think it very much depends on the landscape you're working with. In places that Wildlife Conservation Society works in, there are legally mandated areas that have formal tenure. There are places where there's unclear jurisdiction. There's certainly places where there's overlapping and contended jurisdiction. So that's very much context driven, depending on which landscape you're working in. Is that?
Yeah, understood. So you can have broader application.
Yes.
Okay. A follow-up question. In the absence of a sort of conservation management stakeholder, how effective would this model be? Because in the banking sector, we're looking at what our clients are doing in different industries. And quite often we see in the agribusiness sector, there are customary land rights issues, there's a land dispute, there's an organizer, maybe a company, a corporate will have legitimacy, a legal permit to go in and develop, and there's no conservation organization in there. So I'm just wondering how you would sort of even start to go about getting these groups to come together, where perhaps there's no interest on the corporation side to do so? Do they have some kind of implicit license from the government to go ahead and expand a plantation, for example? So what's the entry point to try and establish a group like this?
I think,
Maybe sometimes it's the process itself that identifies that vacuum. When we did this in Kazakhstan, we got up there and started talking about legitimacy and participation and all these sorts of things, and people just sort of looked at us like, well, they're legitimate because they're in charge, and that's pretty much the state of things in Kazakhstan out in the field, in terms of the way people perceive it. Now you have a government that's actually very willing to do more participatory sorts of things, but it's not traditionally done there. So we had to go take a few steps back and begin to see that maybe one of the leverage points is to begin to create some space for a local constituency for conservation. And sometimes you have to go back, take a few steps back and say, okay, well, what can we put in place to begin to build this constituency for conservation in an area if you don't have sort of any sort of framework for supporting that?
So you would basically, the step back, you're talking about engaging with the local government or the regional government and getting their support, and then going out and the stakeholders.
Or just building the capacity of local people to begin to ask questions of their leadership about these types of things. Over here.
Sorry, I wondered if you could follow up on that, where you have conflicts in authority or power. How have you used your governance tool to move towards effective governance as opposed to conflictual?
I can give you a case in Guatemala, in Petén. There's certainly conflict. The solution there was to develop a consultative group. The major stressor there were narcotraficantes, so drug dealers who were coming in and using the grasslands of one of the protected areas, and paying local communities to invade the protected area as a way to basically protect their landing strips so that they could move cocaine across the border into Mexico. And so serious conflict, serious contested authority. And the only way the solution to that was actually to bring the indigenous Maya community together with the National Park Service to manage the parks, the military, and a presidential advisor. And it was only by bringing those groups together that the actual decision was made to try and, it was the military's responsibility, who had never been involved in management of the Petén, to actually begin to help the communities, enable them to exert their authority. They were powerless against the very powerful narcotraficantes, and they needed the support they needed the support of the military to actually be able to wield their own authority. So in that case, it was finding the right actors to strengthen the power of a weak governance body. Does that make sense?
I just wanted to maybe follow up on the question from Credit Suisse. You're referring to companies, agricultural companies, and mentioning that they perhaps do not have an interest to understand governance in their area. And maybe it's a fair question to put to them that perhaps they should consider these issues. It might be something that you would like, I don't know if it's a matter of investment in them, but you would perhaps consider it's their responsibility to understand governance issues in the area.
Yeah, it makes good business sense, but there's a limit sometimes. I agree. Typically we would push as far as we can for them to do basic governance around environmental, social, community relations, and so on. But quite often, at the end of the day, they have the permits. Maybe they have a strengthened relationship with government decision makers, and you're sort of pushing against swimming against the tide a little bit. So It's challenging.
Back here,
The issue about legitimacy. Just asking if there is not an issue about legitimacy when it comes to sort of predatory companies going into places and getting permits from corrupt governments and having their way with the local communities. I mean, that's pretty much the picture all over the place.
Yeah. Well, I think the question of legitimacy is, particularly where you have customary land rights that are not necessarily given due consideration. You can't say that a company is illegal.
Well, you can't say the company is illegal, but it engages in corrupt practices in order to.
No, it's not corrupt.
Sorry,
It's not corrupt.
it's not corrupt to get a license through corruption.
Well, no, I'm saying that there's many examples, but it's not a question of corruption. It's a question of perhaps some customary rights issues not being reflected.
Thank you. I just wanted to find out something that when you were presenting there, in terms of the coverage in the community. Are we talking of let's say a community or a village that can be spread into 200?